We get a ton of comments asking us what the best exercises are for climbers, and I totally get it. It's hard to figure out when the options seem endless and confusing. But here's the issue. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. However, what we can do is give you a better understanding of the underlying mechanics of climbing, which you can use to help inform your training decisions, as well as some recommendations to get you started. So in this video, we're going to provide a guide to learning the muscles and structures that climbers use most. Plus, we'll have pro climber and coach Dan Beall on hand to provide exercise recommendations for beginners and experienced climbers alike. So let's get into it.
Hello, here we are at Mesa Rim to demo some of these exercises. As you've probably gathered from our previous videos, the exercises that you choose will be predominantly determined by your circumstances and what you're training for, but we're going to go over some exercises that are going to be typically good choices for a lot of people in a lot of circumstances, as well as some variations in why you might choose one or the other. So, as a little bit of context, for most people, strength training should be considered as supplemental to climbing. One of the major mistakes that people fall into is almost filling in around their strength training or fingerboarding work with climbing. And in very few circumstances is that the right move. You really want to think about what the small number of priority movements are that are needed to better facilitate your goals on the wall. Because of this, I try to pick one exercise at a time to do for each of the major sort of movement types. And in some cases, things like vertical pulling and horizontal pulling will actually train very many of the same muscles. So it's not even entirely necessary to pick one from each, as long as you have at least one exercise that hits the major muscle groups. As your level of training experience increases, you'll have probably more time to dedicate to doing these exercises, as well as increased recovery capacity to handle it, and you can start layering on more and more exercises. You will typically see much better traction with fewer exercises done regularly with intention, rather than a whole mix of exercises that you do in a somewhat shotgun kind of approach.
Let's start with the upper body. First, vertical pulling. There are many variations of pull-up-like movements in climbing, all of which will be slightly different in terms of biomechanics, but we can easily learn the most relevant aspects. Lats will be the primary movers of the arms, pulling the arm down, adduction, and back, extension. Meanwhile, the rhomboids and traps will be crucial in rotating and retracting the shoulder blades throughout the entire motion, which is necessary for healthy biomechanics of the shoulder. On top of that, the biceps and brachialis muscles will be critical in flexing the elbows. These are some of the main muscles that will help move you up the wall, or in other words, move your arms from an elevated position to a lowered one. But you may be surprised to learn that the pecs and deltoid muscles also assist depending on the position of the arm. As you can see, pulling up involves a coordinated effort between a lot of different muscles, though some will be taxed more heavily than others. Now, let's hear what Dan has to say.
To a naive eye, and broadly correctly, pull-ups have the best match for climbing in general. You're basically reaching overhead and you're pulling down and then repeating. There is, of course, some variation to this as you climb steeper terrain, as your body sags away from the wall, etc. And so people like to kind of push back on this idea, I think just to be contrarian more than anything. That said, I think that you get better specificity, better stabilization, and better general form cueing as you move into unilateral exercises for pulling specifically. And because of this, as soon as people are able, I try to transition them over to either band-assisted or pulley-assisted water pull-ups, really with whatever kind of assistance. And that, as with fingerboarding, tends to be sort of in the like plus 50 or 60% body weight range. So there are 1,000,001 possible pull-up variations, but the three most common that are going to get kind of the predominant movement patterns for climbing are going to be a traditional sort of shoulder width pull-up, a wide grip pull-up, and a chin-up. For the most part, for most climbers, if you're going to be doing just one vertical pull, I would either go with like a weighted, slightly wide normal pull-up, so kind of in this range. It's just going to be a little bit more comfortable. As you get closer in, like your range of motion is just somewhat reduced. Things don't move as smoothly. So this kind of comes back to wanting progressions to be as continuous and manageable as possible. And so just by getting slightly wider than shoulder width here, for most people, that's going to have the best range of motion, kind of the cleanest mechanics, and it's going to be the most easily overloaded. People sometimes get kind of crazy with these things and get out here. This is fine, but it puts a lot of force on the shoulder. It really reduces the range of motion that you can get, and it's much harder to overload since a relatively smaller weight increment will produce a relatively more difficult pull-up. And so when you do a wide grip, you want to be right around 90-90 like this. This is going to preserve the movement pattern that you want while maximizing the range of motion and being a relatively manageable amount of leverage so that you can continuously overload it without too much difficulty from step to step. For a lot of people, One of the really major strength components in climbing is strong scapular scoop and engagement. And this carries over pretty immediately to pull-ups, which is one of the first exercises that people tend to do for climbing. You very much do not want to be just in a vertical position, looking straight ahead and trying to pull like this. You can, especially if you have really good range of motion, but it's generally going to be better, less tweaky, and carry over a little bit more to the various climbing positions if you think kind of proud chest throughout these things. So you do want to keep your core engaged. You don't want rib flare, which is just going to be a breaking in the lower back. You want to be kind of like tucked and engaged, but you want to also think kind of proud chest, scoop at the scapula, and try to, like, while your core is engaged, have your chest face up towards the ceiling like this. If I'm just kind of in a resting position like this, things maybe get to about here. If I'm sagged forward, not even that much. So you really want to feel everything set and pull backwards, giving you as much overhead range of motion as possible. And as you kind of arc your back here, you're gonna have a really nice line for the pull-ups. Beautiful. So I guess in this case, just full dangle and like kind of just try to pull up straight.
Okay.
It'll be fine, but it'll probably feel a little bit wackier now that you've tried those, hopefully.
Just kind of like straight up.
Yeah, just like straight up and down. Yeah. Yeah, there you go, exactly. So you see how her shoulders kind of arc and then drive forward a little bit in sort of a neutral position like this. Yeah, it's kind of hard to get around. So this really kind of allows things to rotate up and tilt forward. It's not gonna injure almost anyone. I mean, if you have really aggravated shoulders, it might be a bit pinchier. But it's just, this is gonna produce kind of a two-stage movement, which is just weak, and it's gonna teach kind of bad mechanics for generating power over time. And so it's much better to, instead of just kind of like letting it happen, really think about setting up and like ripping through. So once again, the sort of different two-arm variations are best for newer climbers or for overloading with weight. I would do one of each for people who are really new to the sport, as it gives you better exposure to a variety of movement patterns, settling into your sort of favorite one or two as time goes on so that you can really prioritize and overload those. Once you hit something like an additional 50% body weight, it's time to move on to assisted one-arm pull-ups. There are a whole bunch of ways to do this. For most people in most gyms, bands are the most accessible and most convenient, and so that's what we're gonna be demoing today. Come on in, Jason. You're gonna be really focusing, as with all these things, on scapular engagement and sort of like generating good velocity and movement through it. One of the failings that people tend to make when they start training one-arm pull-ups or harder kind of bodyweight calisthenic progressions in general is doing things that are too hard. So when the bulk of your training is around a 1 rep max, it's just gonna be really hard to progress and really hard to recover from. So when you're using a band, choose one that's gonna let you do something in the 4 to 6 rep range, and you're just gonna see a lot more continuous progress with this while maintaining better form and typically less sort of soreness and aggravation. As you get stronger, you can get rid of the band and you can also add weight. Boosh. Yeah. Excellent. Sweet. That's plenty. There are a variety of different sort of form variations here, ranging from a chin-up grip to a sort of typical pull-up grip to something in between at kind of like a sort of scapular 45 here. I think my preference is generally to be kind of in the 45, not all the way turned in, not really forced out. However, the band's gonna kind of encourage a relatively square position, which also happens to carry over pretty well to climbing. So kind of the takeaway is that all three of those will work quite similarly, and whichever one is sort of the most comfortable for you is probably the best, barring some other counterindication. The rep ranges for pull-ups are really pretty forgiving, and it does depend a lot on your training history as well as your objectives. Obviously, to some extent, sport climbers or people wanting to do long, powerful roofs should probably do a bit more. People who are working on sort of short boulders or have been training for a long time can do a bit less, but I would really hesitate to be doing less than 3 each set, and probably not more than 15 either. I think the sweet spot for a lot of people is kind of sort of in the 4 to 6 or 4 to 8 rep range. Can't really go wrong with 5s if you're lacking a reason to do anything else. Yeah, there are other notes on that that are just beyond the scope of this. As a quick note and reminder, pretty much all strength training should be done as fast as possible, as long as you're maintaining form. The idea is just that you want to get really pure motor firing. So the faster you do things, the more your body's going to be trying to do everything together. With heavy weight, you're not actually going to be able to move very fast, but it sort of doesn't matter. It's the intentionality of doing something as quickly as you can, rather than actually moving fast or slow.
Horizontal pulling. Horizontal pulling, which tends to look like pulling into the wall, is a critical move in climbing and something that often gets overshadowed by pull-ups. Horizontal pulling moves the shoulder from a flexed to an extended one, and the scapula from a protracted to a retracted position. This means that the anatomy under significant stress are the retracting and extending muscles, namely the rhomboids and the traps. Of course, the biceps will still be heavily involved to flex the elbow, and the lats will as well as you create shoulder extension, but the key difference from pull-ups here is the increased demand on the scapular retractors. If you find that pull-ups aren't too bad, but you have difficulty with this type of rowing movement, or even find that your biceps fail first, that may be due to weakness or poor engagement of the scapular retractors.
Horizontal pulling is also extremely useful for climbers. It complements pull-ups extremely well. If you're already doing heavy pull-ups and you find that to some extent takes all the time and recovery that you have, I wouldn't necessarily worry too much about adding rows. But remember, there's always some minimal amount of exercise that you can sneak in and you'll barely notice. So if you were to say do your heavy pull-ups and you're like, man, I would really like to experiment with rows, but I don't really have the time to do a full workout with them, nor do I feel like I have kind of like the recovery capacity to do another hard exercise. It's really quite easy to just do one set to failure at a moderately high rep range, kind of like 8 to 12. And that will give you some exposure to that movement pattern. It'll build a little bit of dexterity with the exercise, and it will probably work pretty nicely as a finishing set for the higher intensity, lower rep pull-up exercises. So that said, what does rowing accomplish? One, it plays really, really well with underclings. To some extent, though, you're still doing something fairly similar with a pull-up. The way that you do a row really anchors you into the wall. It's really practical for deep lock-offs, rows, steeper bouldering, and roof climbing. So it has a nice specificity to it. It also, in some cases, can get a little better sort of mid-back engagement, as well as kind of setting up this concentric protraction or retraction of the scapula. Also, as you can kind of see, if you just think about how your humerus and upper arm is tracking, when I'm doing a pull-up, I'm strongest in this range here. This is just going to be like in the mid-range of the muscles. It's where the bulk of the force is going to be. And because of that, people end up sometimes stuck either at this starting range here or in the deep portion of a pull-up, going from kind of face level to below the chin. When you're doing the bottom portion of a pull-up especially, people can get really stuck in here, and so they end up not quite getting the power that they need through the posterior deltoid, mid-back, things like this. And so some of that just comes from being really bound up on the muscles in the elbow. As you kind of transform into a row though, it's the exact same range of motion, but all of a sudden the area that you're strongest in a row is exactly the area that you're weakest in a pull-up. And so it can really help with getting power and depth out of that end portion of a pull-up. With rows, I'm probably most ambivalent about which variation you go with. You want something that is available, comfortable, and progressible. And for different people, that's going to be different things based on their environment. I think a good starting point for a lot of people is just a unilateral dumbbell row, which we'll demonstrate here in a second. The main problem with that is that a lot of climbing gyms don't go up to, they don't have access to super heavy dumbbells. And once you've been training rows for a little bit, I find that your row strength should be a really pretty appreciable portion of your pull-up strength. You know, kind of 60 to 90% depending on things. So given that, if you're a 150-pound dude who can more or less do a one arm, you need a 150-pound dumbbell, or at least a 100-pound dumbbell. So pretty quickly, you're going to probably eclipse what gyms have available, which is why you might want to move on to barbell variations where you can add a sort of arbitrary amount of weight, or a lever type variation where you have the benefit of some degree of leverage disadvantage and using your own body weight as a starting point so that you have to add relatively less weight. For the unilateral dumbbell row, You're gonna wanna bench, typically like a workout bench is fine. You can find blocks, boxes, pads, whatever. They'll all more or less work. You're gonna put your offhand down on the bench. Okay. You're gonna be locked elbow and protracted as with a push-up plus. You want your outside leg forward. So, yep, there you go. Okay. And probably right around shoulder width, maybe a little bit wider. Beautiful. You don't want the weight probably just inside of your foot. Great. And in a perfect world, you'd probably like to be relatively horizontal, but anywhere kind of in this like flat to sort of 45 range is fine. It's gonna have a really similar effect, so just use what you got. From here, you're gonna wanna keep a relatively flat back. You're gonna wanna try to, in a neutral or slightly externally rotated position, think underclings, you're gonna wanna pull basically up to your belly button. You do want to let your scapula protract and then initiate the motion with a scapular retraction, but you don't predominantly, or to some extent at all, want to be getting the force by rotating your trunk just from the scapular set and then through sort of the like lats, pecs, and deltoids. Okay. It can take a little bit of fiddling to find a comfortable foot position.
And then is my hand okay?
Yep, looks great. Good.
Did I rotate too much?
Nope, that's good. Yeah, perfect. So you can kind of play with it as you do these and see if you like a somewhat, really any of these grip positions are gonna be all right. I like to slightly bias this way, as I think it exposes a little bit more bicep and leaves a little bit more room in the shoulder, but really any of this is all right. You probably don't wanna be all the way horizontal with your palm facing you, as it's gonna be a slightly different movement pattern and might be a little bit pinchy. Beautiful. Nice. As you do these for a little bit, it's beneficial to add just a brief pause at the top. That's gonna get a little bit more posterior deltoid engagement and a little bit more kind of clench through the mid-back. It's also very useful for just deep lock-offs. It doesn't need to be very long at all. It's not necessarily like weight and lower. It's just a quick like boom, pause, back down. The higher rep ranges, you're gonna feel a lot more burn in the posterior deltoid and to some extent kind of mid-trap rhomboids. The heavier rep ranges, you're gonna feel a lot more in the lats and pec. A somewhat more advanced version of rows, and also one that's very useful once you've eclipsed the dumbbells available at a gym, especially if they only have little dumbbells, is a full tuck front lever row. So you want to pull both feet as tightly to your chest as possible. This is going to make it as easy and approachable as possible, and also offer you sort of the longest range of motion since you're not going to have to be as levered forward. With these as well, you can do them in kind of whatever grip position you'd like, but my preference is typically either neutral to slightly underclinged. There you go. Yeah, beautiful. So if you can, try to keep your back relatively flat like this, while still having your legs tucked as aggressively as possible against your chest. And then, as with all these things, initiating with the scaps, pull as deeply as you can. Beautiful. These can be pretty hard for people, and so as long as your elbows get at least to your center line and you get a nice 90-degree angle, that's fine. But if you can get deeper like Jason is here, all the better. Beautiful. That's probably plenty. With these, they can be fairly hard initially, and so sets of 3 are totally fine, but before I start adding weight or working up to harder variations, I would try to get kind of into that sort of 5 or 6 rep range as well. It sometimes is a little bit tricky to add weight to these as you would a weighted pull-up, just because if you use a weight belt, which seems to be the most common thing at climbing gyms, it kind of scares me at least that there's some small possibility of somehow blowing off of the rings or having something fail or something and just back flopping onto weights. That seems not good. And so if I don't have a weight belt or vest kind of made for it, a useful kind of in-between is to grab a backpack and just toss, ideally like rubber bumper plates, but a dumbbell will work, a kettlebell will work, kind of whatever you have works. And then just wear that on the front. This is gonna help kind of maintain the center of mass as well. And so this is a just pretty good, pretty cheap DIY option. As a quick note, people often want to move on to harder lever variations instead of adding weight. I typically wouldn't recommend this, though a one-leg tuck can be fine. The more extended you get, the more levered your arms have to be to maintain the form, and the shorter your range of motion gets. Additionally, the more leverage disadvantaged you are, as we discussed earlier, the harder it is to add weight or reps. So typically being kind of as tucked as possible and adding weight generally has better traction for many periods of your training career. doing rows as a sort of priority movement instead of a accessory movement to complement pull-ups, you do want to stick kind of into that classic sort of strength building rep range. Obviously, as more and more research comes out, you can build strength in many rep ranges doing a lot of different things, but sort of 5 or 6 reps seems to work really nicely for rows. As you get into lower rep ranges, it's quite difficult to get the range of motion that you would like. So you're going to be extremely strong in this starting position as you sort of pull through, and you're going to get very weak as soon as your elbow breaks the line of your body. We do want to train this, but one of the things that's really beneficial about rows is actually this real retraction strength. And so if you're using weights that are too heavy to start really getting back here, it is probably not giving you the most bang for your buck. You want the weight to be heavy enough to be challenging at a fairly low rep range, but you want it to be light enough that you get a pretty full range of motion and that you can maintain the quality of the movement pattern. A good way to do this is to start somewhere around 5 or 6 reps, work up to somewhere around 8 to 12 reps. You'll find as you do this what sort of range you're personally able to add another 5 or so pounds, but that's going to push the reps back down. So as an example, let's say we start with 50 pounds, we work up to 10 or 12 reps, we bump up to 55 pounds and we're back down to sort of 6 or 7 reps, and basically just repeat that. Increase reps, add weight, drop reps. There are more advanced programming methods, of course, but that's a pretty good starting point. It will take a lot of people for at least many months.
Shoulder external rotation. We often find ourselves pulling into the wall or doing moves in a way that requires a lot of shoulder external rotation strength. We now get a more significant shift in focus to the external rotators of the shoulder, namely the infraspinatus and teres minor. These muscles, in conjunction with the rhomboids and traps performing scapular retraction, help pull us in close to the wall and stabilize the shoulder. The external rotators play a big role in keeping those shoulders safe and strong while doing those shouldery moves. Without proper strength in these muscles, many climbers will develop shoulder pathologies or be more prone to acute shoulder injuries.
The external rotators are part of the rotator cuff, and they're really important for stabilizing the shoulder joint, especially under dynamic load or if you've had any damage to the passive structures like the labrum. Beyond that, they are also just very practical for being strong on the wall. You probably shouldn't neglect your internal rotators either, but they're typically well trained just by the motions of climbing as well as heavy push work. And so external rotators, for most people, even climbers, tend to lag behind relatively, and so strengthening them is quite useful. But beyond that, the way that you engage on the wall and kind of pull things out, you need strong external rotation so that you can maintain this good form to pull vertically as opposed to getting kind of in this weird like chicken wing position. So it's going to help strengthen the joint, it's going to help prevent injury, it's going to let you stay tighter and more engaged on the wall, and it's actually a fairly substantial component of what people tend to think of as core strength. When my feet are picking, generally speaking, that's because I can't weight them enough. Generally, it's on an overhang. If I can't weight them enough, it's generally because I'm not able to sort of pull back hard enough to keep everything engaged and scooped and kind of like planted on the wall. And so, while of course lots of stuff is going on, the ability to maintain adequate force on holds as you move around is a huge part of what keeps your feet glued onto the wall. A classic with these is some flavor of face pull, but I actually like better something called Cuban rotations, which are done standing, kind of 90-90 this way. You just get a light barbell, or if necessary, light dumbbells, and you're gonna do stuff sort of in the 12 rep range, like this. Typically helpful to have a spotter or a partner initially to help make sure that your elbows are staying in position and everything's nice and engaged. You want to go only as far as is comfortable and use a light enough weight to make sure that you can control the motion, but you do also want to make sure to be progressing this as aggressively as you can. As with every other strength exercise, you only get stronger if you try harder. As you do get more comfortable in these ranges, especially if there's no pain, it's very helpful to experiment with scapular rotation as well. So you can extend the motion by not, you don't really want anterior shift. What you do want is upward rotation of the scapula, allowing you to roll down further. You can then initiate the return by rolling your scapula back into the sort of more external rotator dominant motion. So 1, 2. Now I'll be demonstrating the Cuban rotations with the help from Alina here. First thing you want to do is get a nice light weight. This is about 15 pounds, which is a good starting point for a lot of people. You can do it with dumbbells, but it doesn't tend to cue as well, and they are much harder to progress reasonably since most gyms have fairly large step sizes in dumbbells. So if at all possible, I would try to get like a nice light Olympic bar, or I tend to use an easy bar for like curls and things, but strangely a lot of climbing gyms don't have them. So try to find a light bar and then go from there. First thing you're gonna do is find a grip at a width that gets you into sort of 90 degrees in the shoulders and elbows. Easy way to do this is just pop it up on top of your head. There you go. And then work your hands out until you find a nice distance. That's gonna be right around these marks for Alina.
A little more.
Yeah. Yep, it ends up being wider than you think. So you want your pointer fingers to be kind of where, yep, that's about the spot. Yeah, beautiful. Next thing, you wanna try to keep your scapula set, mid-back flat, little bitty hip tilt. Good, and just keep everything engaged and solid. And then you're going to try to imagine holding your elbows in place. It's good to do with a partner the first couple of times, or at least with a mirror. So trying to keep these more or less locked down. It's okay if they wander a little bit, but you want to try to maintain this plane. You don't want your elbows to be particularly forward. You don't want them to be backwards. It will feel uncomfortable if you do it wrong, happily, but essentially in neutral here. And then rotate the bar forward as far as you comfortably can, holding that position. Tight, 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 tight. As soon as it gets difficult or starts pinching, come back up. And this will be fairly challenging for a lot of people initially, so it's worth doing fairly high reps with moderately light weight initially. Do just a couple more of those if you can.
Sure.
Yeah. People do like 3. And just go as kind of far as is comfortable. There you go. Good, 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 good. And then back up. Excellent.
Yeah, it's a little hard.
Yep, it's a little hard. Good. Now while you're doing that, kind of think about like kind of keeping all this good and tight. And one more. Good. Beautiful. So take a rest. One of the things that can help with this initially is if you think about sort of driving through your wrists, this is going to help both keep your wrists in neutral rather than kind of like either lagging behind or trying to like lead ahead like this. And additionally, when you kind of steer with the wrists, the rotation is a little bit more natural. If you're kind of just thinking about lifting the bar, a lot of people to start with will try to get kind of into the traps, or will try to like pull back in just ways that are a little unnatural. And so if you find that you're having some difficulty cueing, trying to think about sort of like getting a good grip and then steering like through the wrists can be nice for a lot of people. There is a slightly harder variation, which is extremely useful for scapular engagement on more demanding climbing moves. A common problem is that people either have no awareness of what their scapula is doing at all, or they've been trained to keep everything sort of down and back. But in reality, there's a lot of moves that we want to get into that require a greater range of kind of scapular motion. And we don't tend to naturally have well-trained engagement for that. You want things to not just like collapse from set to not set. We want to be able to be strong and aware to kind of have good traction and engagement through these positions so that you're keeping things tight and controlled and that you can stay in the strongest, safest positions possible. This is hard to simulate in a lot of ways, and even this is imperfect, but it does a good job of training you to, in a controlled eccentric, sort of lower your, or upwardly rotate your scapula and then reset the scapula and move back. We may actually have Emil demonstrate these just real quick. All right, so for the initial variation here, keeping all this kind of set, 90-90, nice and flat, in line with your shoulders, you wanna keep your scapula tight and engaged, and just kind of hold this position. That's gonna have the best sort of cueing and initial engagement as you learn this motion. Just go down to kind of 90. Beautiful. Keeping everything kind of tight and in line, back up. But once this feels solid, especially if your shoulders are feeling relatively strong and comfortable and pain-free, you can experiment with this upward rotation. And so we'll do it in 2 parts to start with. So you'll go down to about 90 degrees, kind of coming through the rotator cuff and humerus, and then you're gonna let your scapula slowly rotate upwards to help you get down into this motion. You're actually keeping that pin, you just have good range of motion. So try to like consciously like roll this slightly. Yeah, there you go. Okay. So this is gonna let you get down almost to your chest depending on your physiology and flexibility. You're gonna then wanna reset to kind of get back to here and then pull up through. Beautiful. So try that again, and like as you get down to 90, just really think about like trying to get it out of the scapula. Like try to let this like, yeah, there you go, beautiful. Do a dip wrong. Yeah, good. So by starting to explore this range, it's gonna help with sort of your active flexibility, which is generally good for climbing motions as well as probably general health. And by being able to sort of cue this sort of eccentric, kind of relax and engage, you're gonna have better access and better strength in more positions. But do be a little bit careful, especially with the lower portion. I wouldn't expect it to cause meaningful injury, but it can definitely get pinchy if you go too heavy too fast. Because of that, you're gonna wanna try to find small weights to progress this. Most gyms will have 2.5s, but hopefully your gym will have little 1.5s or smaller. They're easily available online, and you can just order a pack of fractional weight plates to help progress things. As with any strength exercise, you do want to make sure to keep making the exercise more difficult. If you just do the same thing over and over again, you will plateau and not make further progress. However, with these especially, you don't want to be crazily ambitious with it either. But don't you worry, your body will let you know.
Compressing/squeezing. Ever find yourself on a refrigerator block of stone, a killer dihedral, or two sweet opposing holds, squeezing for dear life? If so, you've definitely discovered the important role that the pectoral muscles play in climbing. The pec major muscle in this scenario is primarily an adductor and internal rotator of the shoulder, but it isn't alone. The pec minor helps move the scapula to support that motion, and the little known coracobrachialis muscle is also involved as it helps adduct and flex the shoulder. Of course, we'd be mistaken not to also mention the subscapularis muscle, which is part of the rotator cuff. Its role is to help internally rotate the shoulder and stabilize the humerus. If you find compression moves to be difficult, it could be due to a weakness in the pec or the subscapularis muscles, but it could also be an overall weakness in the external rotators. Why? Because weak external rotators can actually cause our brains to limit the amount of force we can generate with the other opposing muscles. As we'll learn later in this video, the brain typically doesn't allow the body to generate a ton of force in one direction without stability in the opposing muscles. So if all those big, strong internal rotators aren't balanced out by strong external rotators, you may find those muscles don't feel as strong as they should, or you could be at a little higher risk of injuring the rotator cuff itself or the shoulder labrum during intense shoulder movements.
So one of the major movement types of climbing is obviously compression. Lots of sloper stuff in gyms, pinch stuff, erect climbing or bulges outside. It happens a lot. So there aren't many good exercises that are available, overloadable, safe, and well mimic this movement pattern. There are certainly some kind of wacky things you can do, especially if you have the right tools or you're able to build your own training setup. You can kind of hug blocks and stuff, but even then, they're only in kind of minimal ranges of motion. You know, you can get some like big ball holds like from Atomic or some other companies. You can try to hang like, they don't have them here, but some gyms have very thick sort of fingerboard setups. So there's lots of stuff you can try to like hop up and hang, but mostly you can't until you can. And so there's a very narrow band of when that's useful. So not a ton of broad, generally available ways to train compression. And so for the most part, barring special circumstances where there's unusual need or unusual availability, I don't program specific compression training for people. That said, it is very well trained, sort of secondarily, with most push exercises, and even to some extent pulling. So like, if I'm gonna jump out to an arete, this is essentially a wide grip. So it's pretty useful just to build kind of this sort of strength. Dips will help, bench will help, overhead press will help. All of this will strengthen the muscles that are used to basically hug the crap out of things. Generally speaking, if you're gonna be doing a lot of compression climbing, you're gonna build a lot of strength from that. I think just by doing the climbing, you're gonna sample enough different ranges and it's gonna be physical enough that you're gonna see clear improvement there. But as far as supplemental exercises that are available to most people for compression climbing, wide grip pull-ups, which simulate kind of like wide compression and pulling into things, as well as bench press, which is gonna have a good job of sort of like abducting the humerus and kind of coming in on stuff. Both of those seem to carry over really quite well, and those would probably be my first two choices of supplemental exercises for people wanting to do compression boulders.
Pushing. In order to move up or across, you're not always just going to be pulling. Often you have to push as well. Examples of this include gastons, mantles, some lock-offs, and just big moves in general. The triceps and pecs become much more involved to straighten the elbow and stabilize the arm and shoulder blade. Our triceps will also be activated to a much higher extent when pushing laterally. This is true whether pressing in a corner or moving laterally from a gaston position. This is where it gets a bit tricky though, as muscle activation patterns will change depending on where the hold is relative to your body. If the hold is directly in front of your face, your triceps will still be active, but your shoulder will also be stabilized by the external rotators and deltoids. When the move is more towards your side, the triceps are still active, but the deltoids may take on even more force, making these feel like very shouldery moves. Without good strength in the deltoids and the rotator cuff, shouldery moves may be something you find unusually hard or uncomfortable.
General relevant of pushing muscles, The one that you hear all the time is just having antagonist movements to balance things out. Yeah, sure, kind of. It's hard for me to imagine that a relatively balanced musculature isn't in some sense beneficial, but what studies have been done in this regard seem to be somewhat equivocal. However, it's also just kind of ridiculous to think that these don't carry over directly to climbing. If I'm gonna do a pull-up, it's gonna be pecs and lats, and to some extent as I get deeper, triceps. When I do bench press, it's gonna be pecs and deltoids and triceps. So they do complement the pulling motions of climbing, but they also carry over very directly to the musculature that's enabling you to generate force on the wall. They play very nicely with pulling movements, and they're just pretty good for people to do. That said, there are also certain types of things that they certainly seem to work better than pulling. One, of course, is compression, which you can kind of see. If I'm gonna kind of come in and hug something, it's gonna be actually pretty similar to a bench press. So that's a pretty straight carryover. The other one, of course, is dips tend to play fairly well with mantles. Of course, to an extent, the way that you're gonna do a dip is not mostly gonna be exactly the same as how you do a muscle up, but they translate really quite nicely. Going from there, the first thing I look for is practicality and then sort of like the amount of muscle engaged. So I would generally suggest one of dip or bench press, and then your second push, if you're going to do a second one, is going to be either an overhead press or the remaining push. So you could do dips and bench, you could do dips and overhead press, you could do bench and overhead press. Those are kind of the three pairing options that I would initially consider for most people. Though of course there's a million other options as well. I think probably for a lot of climbers, dips is actually probably the sort of best first option. The reason for that is just that both bench press and dip can build really incredible push strength. They actually utilize similar muscles in a somewhat similar way, but a lot of climbing gyms don't have good bench press setups. And when they do, they don't necessarily have spotting bars or things like that. And so it's hard to really confidently go heavy with bench press without a dedicated spotter, which just makes things a little less convenient. Beyond that, dips on rings offer a useful instability component that, in my experience, doesn't particularly detract from progress. Rings in a dip type motion actually get more stable as you add more weight. So yeah, they're just, they're really effective and they're really available. And I think that's kind of where they went out over bench press, is that for a lot of climbers, almost all gyms at this point have rings, but not so many of them have high quality available bench presses that are doable at high weight safely. So I guess the only thing is you generally want rings to be kind of around chest level. You probably don't want to be higher than armpits if you can help it. If you're close to the ground as you're likely to be in this kind of gym setup, just tuck your knees. So, proper form, you want to try to suck your shoulder blades together up at the top, stay relatively vertical here. Exactly, beautiful. So this can be somewhat aggravating on some people's shoulders. Only go as far as you can control and feels comfortable. Beautiful. Okay, so doing these slightly wrongly, which is pretty common, is letting your mid-back arc and coming into sort of a piked bench press kind of position here. A lot of people will do this naturally, and while it's still a good way to build strength and it's not going to hurt you, it doesn't really track as well with harder progressions, and it sort of just becomes redundant with the bench press. While I really like ring dips as an exercise, and they lead to a whole world of gnarly, unapproachable gymnastic skills, they are pretty hard for a lot of people to start with, and so it's important to keep in mind the possibility of progressions rather than just thinking of them as something either unachievable or an impossible place to start. And these are two of the sort of more available progressions that I like. Probably the easiest way to work these, and again is wildly available, you can either order something on Amazon if need be, or most gyms just have it, is just grab a band. This will stabilize the rings, and it'll also make your life easier. Thinner bands to some extent are going to feel nicer since you just don't have a big old fat loop in your palms. So TheraBand makes some nice ones, that's what I tend to use, but any old gym setup will work fine. So anyways, if you just kind of grab these like this, it's gonna keep the rings from wobbling as much, and you can either stand or kneel on the bands as necessary. Given the height of the rings that we're working with here, I would start with a kneel, and I think that will be plenty, but it is going to be relatively easier to be standing since you're just gonna stretch the band more. So if you have a band that's too heavy, you can try kneeling, and if you have a band that's too light, you can try standing. So it's just a way to kind of moderate it. Here you go. A little goofy at first, but it's not really all that hard. There you go. Good.
And then both knees or one?
Yep, both knees. It just purely for comfort. So see how that kind of stabilizes it? It's kind of wobbly, but it's not too bad. So if you lock everything out, turn your wrists out just a little bit, that's gonna, out. Yeah, there you go. That's gonna help you stabilize some, but it will be kind of hard. So as you kind of post up in here and just get kind of tall, that's gonna help kind of control everything somewhat.
Can I stand?
No, this is good. So as you try to lower into a dip, it's gonna get easier the lower you are. So as you sink down, it's gonna actually be easier. And this can travel in some, whatever's the most comfortable position. See how it kind of helps assist with the weight there?
Yeah.
Good. And then kind of spring back up. And if you can, turn the rings back out. This is just good practice.
I feel like a seal.
Yep. So this will improve rapidly, but that's the big problem with dips initially for people is that they feel sort of...
I'm just gonna stay down here.
Yeah, just hide down here, yeah. So this gives you a good way to kind of get exposure to this position without it being too wildly difficult. You're now focusing mostly on sort of stabilizing the rings and controlling the motion, and it's not crazy hard on the push.
Am I doing it right?
Yeah, this is good. Try to get a little taller though. So at the top, just think like boop, and like kind of face your chest up towards the ceiling as a thought.
Move this much?
Not ideally, but you'll get there. Yeah, but it's okay. This certainly isn't like wildly out of control. You'll see people on the ring sometimes just like absolutely dancing around. Good, see? Better already. Yeah, exactly. So pretty quickly your body will learn how to control this motion and it'll get a lot more stable.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right? Look at that.
Yeah. This is hard, man.
Yeah, good. So this is a funny way to do it. I don't like it as much as bands, but it is a greater flexibility. So you can just do like one dip.
Okay.
There you go.
You ready?
Yep. So just kind of tuck your feet back.
Are you
And I'm gonna, yeah, here we go. Beautiful. And then just put both feet on like this. Good. Try to keep them kind of at a 90 like that. As you lower, you can take weight. Boom, 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 boom. There you go. Excellent. And then push with your feet as you go up. Push, 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 push. Excellent. Yeah.
Dang. I need to work on my triceps.
Sick.
I thought they were good. Look at that.
I mean, for not trying it to just do ring dips like out the cuts, yeah, look at that. Boom. Appreciate it,
They're
internet.
just show muscles. What are they called?
Dips are pretty tolerable at fairly low rep ranges. I think for the most part, they work really well as a predominant strength exercise in the sort of 3 to 6 rep range. Kind of 4 to 6 seems to get really good traction for a lot of people, but you can go as low as 3 if you're sort of learning them initially, or you have a stage where you really want to go heavy. Additionally, they can be quite effective up to 10 or 12. So somewhere in there, sort of 3-ish sets of sort of 3 to 12.
Fingers, hands, and wrists. The single most important action in climbing is, of course, gripping holds. No matter what type of hold it is, our ability to grip mainly comes down to 2 muscles in our forearms called the flexor digitorum profundus, or FDP, and the flexor digitorum superficialis, or FDS, which branch off into tendons that attach up to our fingers. When we grab a hold, those flexor muscles contract and tug on the tendons, which cause our fingers to flex. There are also a variety of other smaller connective tissues in our fingers that help stabilize the joints and keep everything together under high loads. The main ones being the annular pulleys, particularly A2 and A4, and the collateral ligaments. The annular pulleys keep the tendon close to the bone, and the collateral ligaments help resist lateral forces, like when we pull hard while our forearms are not directly under our fingers. But grabbing a hold is not just about our fingers. Our wrist extensors actually play a large role in stabilizing the wrist joint, which can then allow our fingers to resist higher forces. Before we get to Dan's recommendations for finger training, our eagle-eyed viewers might be wondering why there was no mention of the finger extensors. You'll hear varying opinions about their importance depending on who you ask. However, in my opinion, the literature suggests that the finger extensors aren't really that useful for finger strength in climbers.
Grip training, of course, deserves its own video, or realistically, series of videos. But there are fairly standard approaches for climbing. Virtually all serious climbers should have some flavor of supplementary grip training in their program, whether it's sort of a fingerboard or a no-hang, campusing, or even just dedicated board climbing. Doing something that intentionally and consistently overloads your grip strength is incredibly useful for climbers. There are an abundance of different types of grips. Each one, luckily, strengthens the others as everything's coming through the same muscle groups, but the way that you engage, the positions in which you engage, and sort of like the supporting needs all end up being a bit different. So you do want to pick ones that are sort of the best aligned with your goals. Generally speaking, I recommend people train 1 to 3 grips at a time. Most climbers will be served quite well with just one single grip that they prioritize. Typically, I go with something that is around 1 full pad, whether that's being trained with one arm or two arms. And I choose to go with whatever grip feels most comfortable for you on the edge that you're training. For most people, it's either going to be kind of a open like chisel crimp or a half crimp. If you feel equally about those two, I would probably say that a half crimp is marginally more useful, but you're definitely going to get the best traction in whichever position is most natural for you, and that's going to be dictated to some extent by personal physiology. I personally tend to grab things in a chisel grip, but if you feel good in both of these, I would probably try to go with the half crimp. There are a huge variety of sort of progression methods and programming schemes. Given that this is sort of a survey video, I would say that 2 to 3 times a week doing sort of 3 to 5 hangs in your preferred position is probably a good way to go. I would typically overload this first by adding small weights and then by reducing weights and increasing volume and kind of oscillating back and forth between those two approaches, just sort of seeking out ways to continue making things in broad strokes more difficult from week to week. If I'm going to add additional grips, I tend to just go with one more. People doing 3 or more grips tend to either have an abundance of time on their hands, or they're doing this in a near professional capacity, or they are restricted in their access to climbing, and so more of their time is being spent on essentially grip sport as opposed to climbing. So if, say, you have a pandemic-based lockdown, or you're traveling, or for whatever reason you just can't get into the gym for an extended period, you can actually do several different grip types. But for the most part, 1 or 2 is good. The second grip that I would go with depends a lot on what your upcoming objectives are. And I would say that the 3 generally good choices are open 3, full crimp, or a pinch block. Pinch blocks are nice because they support a lot of the other grip work. They're good for hypertrophy, they're good for strength endurance, and they don't tend to be super fatiguing for whatever reason. I almost always try to go with a nice big fat brick pinch. I like to be holding it in essentially a half crimp on one side. I find that this just carries over the best to most things because you get the same kind of engagement as you would with sort of a slopier or duck pinch. It gives you some benefit to your half crimp strength. And if you try to kind of cock your hand in as much as you can, you really won't be able to as it gets really heavy, but trying to cock your hand in some is going to make this also carry over fairly well to slopers. So they're just broadly useful, even if you're not necessarily predominantly a crimp climber. But if you're going to be getting on pockets or limestone sport climbing, or have had some ring finger issues and you just want to strengthen that whole range, open 3 is good. And for us California climbers, there's just lots of crimps around, so full crimping can also be kind of your go-to. Even though we've tried to keep this simple, there's clearly an abundance of options here, and even more as you start poking around and experimenting with things. So just a reminder to try to keep it simple and prioritized as much as you can. If you're relatively new to training and you want a very straightforward finger strength routine, I actually think that pull-ups on rungs is probably your best bet. It's going to let you do your vertical pulling and your finger strength in the same place, and sort of 3 to 5 sets of sort of 3 to 5 reps is a really good starting point. At that point, you're still kind of at the start of your journey, so most things will work. But I would try either adding weight or adding reps, whichever you feel is most attainable in the short term. If you find that you've gone kind of as far as you can in one direction or another, you're doing a bunch of reps and you can't really do any more, or you've added a bunch of weight and you can't really add any more, you can just kind of dial back either the weight or the reps and work some in the other direction. And just kind of by popping between those two, you're going to be able to make pretty sustained, pretty significant progress for a while. But then of course people are going to wonder, when should you transition from those to weighted pull-ups and or weighted hangs independently? And the answer is sort of simple. It's whenever you have more time that you're able and willing to dedicate to climbing, as well as a general sense that your body's able to handle the training that you are doing. At that point, just split them up and start overloading each independently, as we discussed, with an increase of reps and or an increase in weight. As long as you're engaged and it doesn't hurt, you can kind of pick any position that you like. It is, as with most of these things, probably prudent to have something of a back arc going on, just because this is going to make more room for the tendons and structures in the joint. But other than that, you can be straight armed, you can be kind of bent, you can be kind of posted in. I personally like kind of a 120 myself, but people will kind of, I do know people who feel best in sort of a 90 degree lock off or in a straight 180 degree hang. Very rarely do people like doing like full deep lock offs. That's typically somewhat aggravating for the elbows for most people. But you can if you want. So a lot of the sort of shoulder and pulling strength that comes about from these heavy isometrics is a happy consequence. But for most people doing fingerboarding, the real goal is finger strength. So you should be in whatever position feels strongest and most comfortable to you, provided that it doesn't produce a pain response of any type. So if it's comfortable and you feel strong, go for it. The things you want to look out for a little bit, just as you kind of measure it, is like, you could find this if you were to lay on like a foam roller and keep everything like really tucked and like kind of smashed down and just see like how far does this go. And so the more kind of like set your scapula is and the more pinned everything is, you don't get super far, but as you kind of like engage into it, you can reach further. As you let your chest kind of reach back, you can get further. As you break through the core, you can reach way further. So all of these are kind of fine, but you don't really want the like real back bend for climbing in general. And so you want to kind of think about like where you can get like with this set well. But if you get the kind of scapular engagement going, this is kind of a range that you can get to. So if you're like this, you're gonna not be really focusing on keeping everything like well pinned back for fingerboarding typically. What's happening is that you're getting just like ripped away. And because of that, being straight overhead, like kind of head forward, like really dangling like this, is likely to cause some impingement for people. But as soon as you just kind of like bow slightly underneath the board, it doesn't really matter where you are in here because you're now out of this kind of impingement range. And so having that kind of like arc and scapular scoop lets you kind of do whatever. But it is interesting, right? Because people don't tend to think about that. They just kind of like toss their arms up and they're like, here seems good. Yeah. But it's like, as you keep all this like pinned and again, like tuck, tight, locked. And so like, that's gonna kind of reduce this. But as you sort of like flex these in, you can actively kind of flex these further back, right? Yeah. But then as you sort of like relax your sort of mid back and just kind of like really bow and just try to reach like as far behind you as you can, it's like now all of a sudden it's kind of like way back there. So you see how like this feels like pretty comfortable and it's almost like a nice stretch. Yeah. But as you kind of like really relax and dangle forward, it still should feel okay. Yeah. But like as you get this loaded, it kind of starts to pinch a little bit in here. Yeah. So basically avoid pinching.
Now let's move on to the lower body. Pushing, the unknown hero to climbing, the flexor hallucis longus muscle, or FHL. It flexes the big toe and in conjunction with the flexor digitorum muscle of the foot are what allow us to pull into holds and push off of those tiny crystal chips.
What do you guys call them? Crystal chips?
Of course, if we're talking about pushing with our legs, let's not forget about the calf muscles, the gastrocnemius and soleus, which allow you to stand further up on your feet while climbing. And also the peroneals and posterior tibialis muscles, which are more active when performing edging. Moving up the leg now, we would of course get nowhere without the quads and glutes to help push us up the wall. The quads help extend the knee while the glutes help extend the upper thigh as we go from a more bent knee and flexed hip position to a straighter extended position. If you find it extremely difficult to get out of high foot positions, you may benefit from additional training here.
If you're a climber who's choosing to incorporate leg strength, you want to pick something that's going to be effective, of course, but if it can have some secondary benefit like sort of increased proprioception and balance, some degree of coordination, something that's just going to kind of bring more to the table. So you don't necessarily need to do something like a heavy back squat, which is going to potentially really drive strength and hypertrophy. But we don't really want or need super heavy legs, nor do we need like freakishly strong legs, which is why things like bodyweight squats or jumps, if you're relatively new to training these things, or single leg squats, archer squats, Cossack squats, to some extent like sissy or split squats. There are a lot of options that you can do in a lot of different circumstances, and I like things that don't need too much weighting and can be done more or less anywhere. So with a simple slider, you can do some nice progressions. I'm just going to demonstrate the single leg squat here because there's so many useful choices, but this is a flavor that you see a lot of people doing and it's pretty easy to work to. So you can do stuff like grabbing a beam, using a band, doing all kinds of stuff. But this is just really very accommodating. The form ends up being a little weird if you use the front of your foot. It's generally easier to cue with a heel. So stabilizing, guiding, and assisting with the off foot, you just sit down. As we discussed in one of our other videos, if you try to stand straight up and kind of lean backwards, it's going to be really hard. So you want to make sure to lean forward, try to keep your weight over your foot as much as possible, and press back up. Sets of kind of, honestly, like 1 to 10. They're really very forgiving. Kind of do what you can. Once you move past those, you can move on to just sort of normal single legs. Same deal, they're gonna be easier with counterweight keeping you forward because getting out of the hole there at the bottom is gonna be the hardest portion. So you want to keep things as forward and tight as possible. For bonus points, try to keep your leg as straight as you can. And that's that. Having relatively good strength through a strong balanced range is pretty important. Like, I don't have any need to do a double body weight squat. I mean, I don't know, maybe I could, but it's like, you just don't really need that for climbing for the most part. It's like, the way that you're gonna be using your foot is, the most strength that a foot is going to need climbing is going to be standing up on a foothold, which is gonna be essentially a single leg squat. There's some other variations that I like as well, but essentially a single leg squat. Or trying to create a lot of force quickly to jump. And both of those can be trained quite nicely just with body weight or with small additional weight, and only really if you need to. If it's not something that's driving on your projects, as we've mentioned before, you don't necessarily need to try to strengthen all the things all the time. But sort of fast single leg jumps will be kind of oodles for most people.
Pulling. The toe pull is very similar to the toe push. It will heavily involve the FHL muscle, the calf muscles, and other ankle stabilizers, but will also have a heavier activation of the hamstring, glutes, and back muscles. While the strength of these muscles isn't generally what will limit your climbing ability or cause you to fail on an overhanging route, maintaining good engagement and control of them while moving, aka having good coordination, is extremely useful. Also, coordination of certain core muscles like the obliques and paraspinals will help you maintain control of your upper and lower body, which will be important when trying to do a coordinated move with constant pressure on your toes. We'll link our core strength versus body tension vid in the show notes if you're interested. Another example of pulling in is when trying to get your hips closer to the wall. This isn't just the arms after all, but rather includes lots of activation of the glute muscles, particularly the glute max, as well as great mobility in the adductor muscles to allow you to open the hips up.
For the hamstrings, same sort of deal. There's lots of ways to train it, but which one is best is strongly situationally dependent, but you can do things like deadlift or hamstring curls or glute ham raises or Nordics. But if you just sort of Google hamstring exercises, more or less all of them will more or less work for climbing. But I wouldn't necessarily take too much time to do it if you're not spending a lot of your time rock climbing. People who are professionals or just really, really dedicated to the sport, it may be worth carving out some extra time to do, or if you have injuries or a heel hook intensive project. But for most people, most of the time, it's just not super necessary.
Toe hooking. The toe hook is accomplished by the opposite muscle groups of the toe pull, so the toe extensors and the tibialis anterior muscle. This muscle performs dorsiflexion of the ankle, which places it into a position more capable of hooking onto a hold. The rectus femoris of the thigh, which is one of the quad muscles, the hip flexors, the iliacus and psoas muscles, and the rectus abdominis of the core will also be more active in toe hooks as they help flex the hip and trunk, which are useful for maintaining tension in the toe hook. Depending on your body position, internal or external rotation of the hip may also be required to maintain the position, which may mean activation of other various hip muscles, such as the gluteus minimus, sartorius, and other adductor muscles, such as the adductor brevis, which will also contribute. If you have difficulty placing and maintaining toe hooks, the problem often comes down to a limitation in lower extremity flexibility or a strength deficit or a combination of the two. Or if all that seems fine and you still suck at toe hooks, it could be a weakness of the tibialis anterior muscle or just a coordination or technique issue that requires more practice.
Toe hooking is a funny one. It's predominantly, the limiting factor for toe hooks is predominantly hip flexor strength, being able to like pull into positions. It is useful to train the shin blade. God damn it, I can't remember what it's called. Yeah, the tibialis anterior, there you go. It's useful to train the tibialis anterior, and things like bat hangs on a pull-up bar can be quite amusing as well as effective if you have access to that. An approach that is utilized by a variety of competitive teams that I think is relatively effective is simply getting a heavy band wrapped around one of these things. Then you can just do pulls in a couple of different orientations towards your face. That gets some tibialis anterior and hip flexor. It's worth noting that with toe hooks, where most people end up failing is poor body positioning. So if I have a toe hook that's just not in the right place, it's just not going to stay very well. So it's a lot more kind of like side pulls, especially sort of slopey side pulls. You want to find a position that lets you kind of fall through and engage on a toe hook, and you're typically using it more for balance than like really ripping on it. So with heel hooks, you're doing a lot more like crushing things into the wall and making the force. With toe hooks, you're doing a lot more just body positioning and balance to keep opposition and let you move around. All right, so we're over here by the wall to demonstrate a little bit of toe hook technique. As we discussed, there are certainly muscular strengths that help with toe hooks, but more than some of the other movement patterns that we've discussed, these are going to be much more technique-based than strength-based as far as getting good efficacy out of them. So we're going to do a couple of examples. So with toe hooks, they're just like side pulls or underclings. Getting into the right frame makes them quite effective, but as soon as you end up in the wrong body position, in this case, trying to stay too close to the toe hook, it doesn't really engage and it really shorts you. You almost can't keep it on the wall at all. And so that's not really a strength thing. It's a question of where your balance is and whether or not you're being able to activate through the hold.
Heel hooking. Heel hooks allow us to pull vertically as well as horizontally. For vertical pulling, the 4 primary muscles involved are the biceps femoris, short and long head, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus. Each muscle has a slightly different role. The biceps femoris muscles flex the knee and extend the hip while performing slight external rotation of the knee, whereas the semi-muscles perform mostly the same role, except that they perform slight internal rotation of the knee. Since heel hooks are more often performed in an externally rotated position, the biceps femoris muscles are often what create most of the pulling force and are often the ones that get injured. If the leg is more externally rotated, the glute max will also be involved, which also increases tautness of the IT band and is why some people suffer IT band strains from a heel hook movement. For horizontal pulling with the heel hook, you need even more external rotation of the leg and will generate more force in the glute max as it tries to extend the leg, which helps pull you in closer to the wall. The biceps femoris will still be heavily taxed in this position, and this is where certain knee injuries can become more prevalent if you don't have appropriate external rotation range of motion of the hip. The leg may compensate to make up for the lack of external rotation at the hip by simply rotating more at the knee joint, which will place additional stress on the ligaments and the meniscus.
Heel hooking has 2 components, and it's actually quite a bit more strength-oriented than toe hooks, and so having quite strong glutes and hamstrings is really useful. The way that people tend to think of heel hooks, and really for the most part the way that they are utilized, is just like a vicious hamstring action. But you do want glute strength to support it and kind of keep everything stable. The big thing to note is that when a heel is around a corner, you are essentially just cranking on it and using that to kind of rock up and over. But the second type of heel hook, which is the sort of like high rotating heel hook, you can train that external rotation strength, but that's not normally the limiting factor, and it appears to be part of what drives risk of knee injury. So when you're doing a kind of like more rotationally dominant sort of in-plane heel hook, it's really useful to think of it as a hip hinge rather than a rotation. And so when you set it, you don't want to think about cranking it down to your body. You want to think about pulling your hips up over the foot, at which point you're now back in line to get into a hamstring. Again, there aren't a ton of methods that are universally available. I personally actually really like a company called Monkey Feet, which makes a little attachment that you can grab weights with, and then you can just do standing hamstring curls. But barring that, deadlifts can be good, but they are typically just in one range. To some extent, Nordic curls are really good, but they're extremely hard. So if somehow you have access to a normal weight gym and you want to train heel hooks, some of the hamstring curl machines are probably your best bet. The big thing with these is they are stupid hard. They can be really rough on your kneecap, and so you want something as soft as possible to do them on. And you need a fairly firm thing to hold your ankles down. I have a bunch of friends who try to do these, and they'll like lift their beds and things. So hopefully you have a good burly partner. There we go. Which will all get you helpfully back to part 1, which is they're really hard. So as you're doing these, it's a little bit reverse of some of the things that we've talked about previously because you're maintaining posterior core instead of anterior core. You do still kind of want this tuck, but you also want to like kind of engage through the back and just try to keep a tight line here. And then just flex the shit out of your glutes and hamstrings and see what happens. So try to just, yeah, there you go, excellent, yep, beautiful. I'm actually pretty impressed. But yeah, that.
You started to lift me up.
Yep. Yeah. Well, the start is fine, but it's like as you get lower, which is where you're gonna have to progress these anyways, you put a substantial amount of force into the heel hooks. So, Yeah, they're a really good exercise. They're very hard. You can do partials, but the problem is that it's such, let's actually do this one more time and we'll just run a little commentary. The problem is that they get harder really, really, really fast. So this is gonna be quite difficult. And you can try to pull back up from here, and that's how people tend to do it. Yeah, exactly, yep. So if you were to do these, you try to feather it so that you find the range where you can kind of control things. It's pretty easy to want to break in the hips. So when you go back, you wanna drive through the shoulders rather than through the butt, which is gonna bend you at the hips. Exactly, yeah, you can. I mean, that does something, but it's like, since the action that you're looking for is through the knee joint, if you bend at the hips, it's sort of like doing a sit-up versus a crunch, right? You're holding an isometric rather than going through it. Exactly. So you want to find a line where you can do this kind of motion, but it really quickly goes from like very easy to pretty hard to impossibly hard. And so that's the biggest issue that I have with this exercise. They are great if you have access and a willing partner, but they take a lot of discipline and sort of try hard effort to make them effective, which for a lot of people is just going to be kind of inconsistent. But they're good. If you do them a lot, you'll get real strong, and they have a substantial protective effect on the hamstrings. So,
leg adducting and abducting. Ever reach that foot far out to the side, barely snag the foothold, and then use your leg to help pull you over and weight the foot better? The adductors and abductors are extremely utilized in this position. First, you have to use your abductors to swing your leg over to the hold. Then you have to use your adductor muscles to pull yourself over and stabilize throughout the movement. And of course, if you don't have good mobility or muscle length of the adductors, you'll never be able to get your foot there in the first place. But there's so much more. The hip abductors and adductors are quite important for many other actions, some of them quite niche, but nonetheless useful. We know that the glutes help stabilize us during heel hooks, but did you know that the adductors of the other leg are also extremely helpful? By pressing into the wall, they allow you to generate more force in the heel hooking leg. And what about dihedrals? Both abductors and adductors are active now at various times, whether it's pushing out into the wall or trying to press up while in the abducted position. In essence, the hip abductors and adductors are extremely useful in climbing, especially when there is any lateral or side-to-side movement.
The abductors and adductors are both important muscle groups, and they're used in most climbing motions, but they're rarely the weak link for things. If they are, you're gonna have to figure out some way to train it, sorry. But for most people, they're not, and almost more importantly, there aren't that many good available ways to do it. And so I typically just wouldn't worry about it. Any sort of leg exercise that you do will train them to an extent. And a lot of the motions of climbing, where you're heel hooking, clamping, pulling, rocking over on things, like, they will get trained via climbing fairly well. And it's quite infrequent that I see them as being a weak link. But if for some reason you think that they are for you, there are ways to train them either in conventional gyms or with some creativity with bodyweight motions. So most of the adductor-abductor work that you're gonna be doing is essentially clamp type things. And this is the world's laziest way to train them. Find something to kind of assist with, because you're gonna need it. Find something slippery, ideally sliders, socks can work in a pinch, and just kind of like slink out into something like a splits and press back up. If you can do it with no hands, fantastic, but at that point you definitely don't need to train them. I'll do this sometimes when I'm like making coffee with like my counter at my house, back of a chair, something like that. But all you do, I'll try to turn sideways and see if this works at all. We'll use one ring. You just slide and then squeeze. That's it. Do kind of as many sets as your general groin region can handle, and you'll be good.
If you're interested in virtual or in-person coaching with Dan Beall, he offers various plans as well as one-off calls where you can get tons of questions answered in a short amount of time with no commitment. Let us know down in the comments what some of your favorite exercises are for climbing and why. And remember to save or bookmark this video if you want to keep it as a reference guide. Thanks to everyone who supports this channel. We've got sweet t-shirts and affiliate links down in the description if you want to use them. And until next time, train, climb, send, and repeat.